Hello, I'm Femi OK and you're in the stream. On today's program, could a website or YouTube video turn a person towards terror? How do people become radicalized online and what should be done to stop it? Our digital producer Malika Bilal is here looking out for your live feedback. Malika, we're getting quite a bit online. What are people saying?
You're right, Femi. There's lots of conversation around this topic. And so to hone in on it, we asked our community a question. How strong is the link from radicalization to violent acts? And a lot of people wrote back saying, well, first of all, you have to define what radical is. Cage Prisoners tweets, radicalization, in quotes, is more akin to witchcraft and has little scientific evidence, but makes money for the de-radicalizers. Now, for those of you at home, if you agree with that or have your own thoughts, we want you to join the conversation by using the hashtag AJStream.
Sitting next to Malika, he's already making notes. He's good. He is Harris Taran. He is joining us in the studio. He's Washington, D.C.'s director for the Muslim Public Affairs Council, and that's a civil rights group based in the United States. Harris, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Now remember, this is a show that's driven by your participation. So if you have a topic or story you'd like to see covered right here, just let us know. And you can go to facebook.com/AJStream and add your suggestions, your comments, and there are plenty of places for you to actually put in your suggestions and then be part of our program. In the meantime, here's a look at some of the Twitter hashtags our community is following. Self-radicalized via the internet. That's how US investigators have described Boston Marathon bombing suspects Dzhokhar and Tamerlan Tsarnaev. The brothers allegedly went online to find websites and other resources calling for violence against the United States. Counterterrorism experts say that Al-Qaeda and similar groups are increasingly using social media to recruit followers and spread their ideologies. But to what extent does surfing the so-called jihadi web actually lead to violence? And what can be done to address online radicalization without harming civil liberties and free speech? Here to discuss these issues with us is J.M. Berger. He's a terrorism analyst with the website IntelWire and author of Jihad Joe, Americans Who Go to War in the Name of Islam. He joins us from Cambridge, Massachusetts. And in Toronto, we have Mubin Sheikh, formerly of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. Back in 2006, Mubin was one of the undercover operatives who helped reveal what's become known as the Toronto 18 terror plot. Mubin and JM, welcome to you both. JM, this is your speciality, so I want to start with you. In terms of radicalization, as far as you're concerned, what is it?
When I use the word radicalization, what I'm talking about is the move toward a philosophy or a ideology that explicitly embraces violence. It doesn't necessarily mean a move toward violence. And that's something that is often mistaken. When we talk about radicalization, there are millions of people who fit that definition of radicalization without ever becoming terrorists or becoming violent.
Mubin, you've got a really unique take on this subject because at some point, I suppose we could put it in our conversation that you were self-radicalized. Tell us your story.
Yes. I'm born and raised in Toronto, Canada. Lived a very normal life. I think because of identity culture, identity conflicts and value conflicts, I rebounded into extreme religiosity at the age of 19. I ended up in India and Pakistan. While in Pakistan, I met the Taliban, who I didn't know at the time, but you know, they told me basically the only way to change the world is through this, and he held up his AK-47. And then when I returned back to Canada in September '95, the Taliban had taken over, and I took that as a validation of the truth of their beliefs. And so I perpetuated the jihadist doctrine until the 9/11 attacks, which really shook my faith. I moved to Syria for 2 years. I studied Arabic Islamic studies. I realized how I had the interpretations all wrong. I came back The intelligence services, recruited me because of my knowledge in the community, my access to the groups, and I've been pretty much at it since.
Harris, from the community perspective, have you seen any examples of Muslims in the US being radicalized via the internet? Can you say, okay, I see why people are concerned because I've seen this example?
Well, I think it's extremely important for us to put this threat into perspective. The fact that this threat is a very small threat within the American Muslim community is something to understand, because when we react to this threat, we can either overreact or we can make sure that we have a very concise and surgical reaction to addressing the problem. There have been incidents of self-radicalization within the community in the U.S. There's been incidents in Virginia. There's been incidents at the Fort Hood shooter. Very few individuals who have used online radicalization as a way to reinforce their thoughts and their violent extremist ideology.
JM, this is your area of study. If you looked at the internet and then you looked at the end product in terms of extreme radical activity, what's the connection between the two? Do you see one?
Well, I think the key word in what Harris just said is reinforce. So people become radicalized through a number of different paths. They don't tend to become radicalized because they run across, for instance, Al-Qaeda's English language magazine Inspire online. More often they become radicalized because of what they see on TV and what they hear their friends talking about. The internet provides you with ways to justify and support that belief. Once you have that core belief, for when most people, the role of the internet is to then provide you with facts and a filtered view of reality that helps to make you more committed to the radical idea.
Well, JM, along those same lines, our community is going back to this definition of radical. On Twitter, Fila says, Al-Qaeda and Islamists are just convenient, catchy marketing phrases used to pitch radicals as being only Muslims. And Dr. Suad tweets in, I hope today's guests aren't only Muslims or talking about Muslims. So this idea of radical extends past the Muslim community, correct? Could you talk about that?
Sure. I study all kinds of radicalization. I'm not only interested in radicalization when it concerns Muslims. I've done significant amount of research and writing on right-wing terrorism in the United States, including white supremacists and anti-government movements. There are a lot of commonalities in how these things play out. Mubin said identity, and that's really what this comes down to when we're talking about radicalization and the kind of radicalization that leads to violence. Most often it's identity politics, where you identify with a specific group, a specific kind of self-description so excessively that it tends to blind you to other things in the world.
I think what's important is that if you look at the history of radicalization in the U.S., this is new to the conversation around American Muslims or Muslims in general. You've had militia groups, right-wing militia groups. You've had neo-Nazi groups who have engaged in this process and have been have shown extremely problematic acts of violence, whether it's the Oklahoma City bombings, whether it's the FBI constantly engaging and sending informants into these militia groups. The Southern Poverty Law Center actually talks about the proliferation of a lot of these right-wing neo-Nazi groups, 1,000% increase in a lot of these groups since 9/11. And so the conversation should not be focused around the Muslim community or American Muslim community, but I think unfortunately right now, since 9/11, since the bombings in Boston, policymakers are talking about them, and if we don't engage in that conversation from the community perspective, we're going to have problematic policies instituted on our behalf without us being around a table.
JM?
I just want to say I agree with the general direction of that statement. I will point out I've done some writing about the Southern Poverty Law Center statistics. They're a little complicated in terms of how they make their count and how they measure increases. But I do agree that it needs to be a broader discussion. The other thing is, one reason that the direction of these public conversation about radicalization tends to go toward Al-Qaeda-oriented ideologies is that they're much more focused on the random killing of civilians, whereas right-wing groups in this country are often more targeted. Certainly white supremacists are involved in hate crimes. There's an issue with counting that. We don't have consistent standards for counting that. But anti-government groups in this country tend to target government and military, and so it's a different kind of dynamic. There is some imbalance in this. I wouldn't deny that at all. But I do think that it is partly motivated by the fact that an Al-Qaeda-related group is more likely to, for instance, target a marathon.
Right, and Mubin, shifting gears here just a little bit, I want to talk about demographics. There's a tweet from a lone rambler. He writes, need to consider the demographics being targeted by the spread of extreme ideology. How vulnerable are they to internalizing such ideas? And on Facebook, along the same lines, Daniel says, there's always been people who have this type of gullible personality across all races, regions of our planet. Most people see crazy propaganda, while others see truth. Now, as Femi mentioned, Mubin, you were an undercover operative. What are the demographics of the type of person that could be led into this?
You're generally looking at young males, 18 to 32, especially in the domestic context. And again, let's do what everyone is doing. Let's take a step back and not look at just one group in particular. You will find that this is an issue of human nature, the way that individuals behave within groups, the way groups behave with other groups, especially groups that are considered out groups. It's the same across the board. And as J.M. Berger was mentioning his studies regarding the far right, anti-government types, you will find the same variables active across the board. Some time ago, Google Ideas had a summit where they gathered 4 categories of violent extremists: ultranationalists, white supremacists, religiously motivated, and urban street gangs. And they compared and contrast the mechanisms by which people come into these groups and the mechanisms by which they got out. And one of the things you'll see is that the demographic is generally the same. You're dealing with angry youth. For whatever reason, they frame the reality in such a way that X person or X group is now the bad guy. Whether you're dealing with a white supremacist, a jihadi, a gangbanger, it's going to be the same type of dynamic. And the demographic is, again, young males overwhelmingly. Of course, you're going to have females, but it's going to be young males who are already angry, have subscribed to codes of honor that are linked to violence. This is another thing that's very prevalent, especially with jihadi activists in particular.
What I would contend with this idea that a lot of these individuals are gullible. There's a narrative conversation that needs to be had here, especially online. The narrative that violent extremists, groups like Al-Qaeda, groups like Al-Shabaab, the Taliban, put out there is a very simple narrative. It's a simplistic narrative, yet a very emotive and powerful narrative. Their narrative is that the U.S. is at war with Islam and the U.S. is at war with Muslims. It's a very simplistic narrative. Now, it doesn't take into consideration the nuances and intricacies of international policy and foreign affairs. And so when people respond to these narratives, they don't respond in the same simple, simplistic kind of fashion. So online, if you get a video from Al-Qaeda or you get a video from the Taliban or Al-Shabaab, it'll be very emotive. The imagery will be very, very intense.
Harris, as you're speaking, I'm going to play Anwar al-Awlaki's his posthumous call after he died. Right. And then you can carry on talking. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I just want people to see the sort of videos that they can actually get on YouTube.
Exactly.
Will not cease. To the American people, I say, your security will continue to be threatened.
So if you see this, and you can see this anywhere in the world, on YouTube, what's the impact as far as you're concerned?
The impact is, when you have policy grievances that are real, and I think that's the first thing that we have to say, that an individual who has a policy grievance, whether it's war, whether it's the use of drones or whatever it may be, there are real policy issues that individuals can have, and you can have concerns for these issues. Now, when a person doesn't have the social network, doesn't have the safe spaces to discuss these policy grievances and carry out actions through civic and political engagement, and are isolated and are maybe personally going through issues of depression and other issues, then they go online. And here Anwar al-Awlaki makes it very simple. Attack civilians, because they're responsible for voting in Barack Obama or George Bush, and they're responsible for killing people.
Harris, I just want to check in with Mubin, just for a moment, Mubin. I'm looking here at the spring edition of Inspire magazine, and if I was so inclined, I could work out how to do guerrilla warfare. I could actually work out how to blow up car parking lots, how to make my own firebomb. If you're one of the young people in the demographic that you described, what effect does this have on a person before they've even maybe thought about doing anything violent?
Right. So I think I want to go back to what both Harris and J.M. Berger mentioned, and J.M. Berger highlighted the word reinforce. And you know, my question is, why is it that they're viewing those videos or downloading those materials? Do they already believe that they have to do something, and now it's just a matter of getting the reinforcement, getting the validation, maybe through ideology, getting the know-how, maybe through bomb-making recipes? So it again depends on what the person's state of mind is before they download those documents. But assuming they're not, assuming they're just out there, maybe it's curiosity sometimes. They want to see what kind of stuff is being put out there. But for those, there is a small group of people who, if they have already been led down the road to think, okay, maybe start thinking about it, then when they see this stuff that they consider to be a persuasive narrative, it makes it easier for them. And just one last point, Harris made a very, very important point about the narrative and simplifying the narrative. When you have people in the public space who regurgitate and perpetuate and reinforce that idea that this is a war against Islam, that is truly aiding and abetting the Al-Qaeda narrative. So these counter narratives are also becoming part of the radicalization process.
You know, we have an interesting view from a member of our community member who sent in a video comment. Harris, have a listen.
Sure.
If you're a guy like the two brothers, who carried out the bombing in Boston, they were very disgruntled. They had a lot of discontentment towards mainstream American society, and so they went online and they gravitated towards jihadist type of content. In my case, I was very fed up with Islamist thinking, very fed up with religious dogmatism, and that's why when I went online, I started gravitating towards liberal Arab blogs, and I started reading stuff about secularism and democracy and human rights, and that had a very profound impact on me. So it really depends on what you are very disgruntled towards and what you're angry about and what you're fed up with.
So does Amar's words kind of dispute the notion that you go online and you can be more radicalized, quote unquote? Because like as he says, he went on and was pleasantly surprised to find the opposite of what he was expecting.
Well, I think Amar's point was reinforces the whole idea of the internet acting as a reinforcer. He had certain beliefs prior to him going online. He was disgruntled with what he called extreme religious doctrine, went online, found the liberal and kind of secular forces and engaged in those. Now this is, I would like to address one issue, is the issue of religiosity, because there's a false notion out there that people who are more religious or conservative in their religious outlook in life and have knowledge of their religious faith are more prone to violence. All studies suggest the opposite, that if you are more rigorously trained religiously, if you have traditional religious knowledge, you are less prone to violence. And I think that's important to realize, because the public conversation, especially after Boston, that this individual had a religious awakening and that him and his mom became religious. What happens a lot of times is they may become religious and have a religious awakening, but they skip rigorous religious knowledge and they move into political understanding and ideology. And because they don't have correct religious knowledge, they then take political ideologies, interpret them as religious knowledge, and then are prone to these, what I would call them generally, online predators. People like Anwar al-Awlaki and Adam Gadon.
JM?
I think there's a lot to be said for what that description of how this process happens. The thing about religiosity is that it does occur with some of these people. Religiosity does not equate to legitimate knowledge of the religion. So in the case of Tamerlan Tsarnaev, the elder brother of the Boston bombers, what we saw and what we often see in these cases, not always but often, is a sudden shift toward extreme obsession with religion that sort of takes place very quickly and is very transformative in somebody's life. Converts tend to figure pretty statistically significantly in kind of the groups that we look at. These are often people who don't have a very strong knowledge of the religion. They may have tendencies towards radicalism or militantism or an inclination to violence, and they just latch on to a path that seems to them to reinforce that. So, a lot of times we see converts who have very little knowledge of the actual religion, who get ideas into their heads and are often manipulated by individuals, but sometimes they teach themselves. And, sometimes you can see some of these discussions between people who've been radicalized and people who have actually spent years studying Islam online and other places, and it's embarrassing for the radicals.
Mubin, I just want to go to you for one final comment in this part of the program, and that is about prevention. You've been in both sides of the camp. You've been radicalized, you've been fighting radicals. From your perspective, what should governments be doing? What should communities be doing?
Right, okay. So then let me just piggyback off of what Harris was saying about religious knowledge. This is in fact what happened to me. I learned proper Islamic studies, and I got out of it. And this leads to answer your question. I think one of the things is you need to include the Muslim community. Number two, you need to have a counter-violent extremist narrative that appeals to the Islamic sources. As far as government is concerned, government needs to deal with these communities more as partners and not subjects of investigations and suspects. We have to work together. Otherwise, we'll both lose.
We are going to keep this conversation going. It's going to be picking it up in the post show. And to join us there, you go to stream.aljazeera.com. One of the things I want to ask JM and Harris and Mubin in particular is, if somebody is in your community and they are being radicalized, how do you know? How can you spot them? That is something that we will continue in just a moment. But right now, Malika has a look at some of the other stories we're following.
What's the connection between the FBI and kebsa, a rice dish from Saudi Arabia? The answer is a pressure cooker. Pictured here is Salal Al-Ruki, a Saudi student in Michigan who was allegedly questioned by the FBI after neighbors saw him with a cooker. As reported in the Saudi Gazette newspaper, this raised an alarm because the Boston Marathon bombs were built using the cooking device. Al-Ruki reportedly said FBI agents searched his residence and asked him about taking it outside the apartment. I explained to them that I took this to the apartment of my friend to prepare kebsa as dinner, he said. He said the agents checked the pot, and when they found nothing unusual, they cautioned me not to venture out again with the pressure cooker. Next up, rocks and chairs flew in the streets of Beijing on Sunday, and all of it was caught on camera. Chinese artist and activist Ai Weiwei filmed the violent brawl. He reported that the fight broke out after Han Chinese restaurant owners destroyed a stall run by Tibetan street vendors. Ai added on Twitter that by the time he was on the scene, there were already several Tibetans who had bloodied heads. The police were very self-disciplined. There's more on this story on our website, so check it out at stream.aljazeera.com. And as always, we want to hear from you. So let us know what stories you want us to cover. Just tweet us with the hashtag AJStream. Femi?
Harris, with that pressure cooker story, I didn't know whether to laugh or to cry. I think I was doing a bit of both. What was your reaction?
No, I think I had the same reaction. I cook kebsa myself at times, and
Nice.
I use a pressure cooker, so I can imagine what this young man had been feeling. But unfortunately, that's the reality of this public conversation that we have. When something so innocent is taken and made into a national controversy, I think we need to be vigilant to ensure that we don't over-stereotype.
Okay, he's Harris Taran. If you liked him, there's more of him in the post show coming up in just a moment. But on tomorrow's show, people are dying so we can wear $10 shirts. We look at the real costs of fashion and our responsibilities as consumers. Stay with us. The post show is next. We will see you online. Hello again, this is the Streams Online Post Show and we're talking about online radicalisation. How serious of a threat is it and how should we respond? Let's get back to our conversation. On set we have Harris Taryn, he's from the Muslim Public Affairs Council. On Skype in Cambridge, Massachusetts, J.M. Berger, founder of Intelwire website, and on Skype in Toronto, Mubin Sheikh, former Canadian intelligence agent. There was a little statistic, Harris, teased us with in that tiny little break we had. I think it kind of puts everything in perspective. What was it?
Yeah, the reality in terms of putting this whole threat into perspective, more people on an annual basis die from bathtub drowning than from Islamist, radical extremist violence. And I think that's important to take into consideration. Although it is a threat, I think the threat itself is more of a psychological threat in society. No society would accept the fact that their political views would be administered through violence, and I think that's the key to think about when we think about this threat.
Every time we see an incident of terrorism, Fort Hood,
Right.
the Boston Marathon bombers, everybody in the community says, I didn't realise, or I wasn't sure, or I didn't say, or so. One of the things I wanted our audience to understand and have a takeaway about was, how do you know if somebody is getting information from online, if they are self-radicalized? Mubin, you're as good a person as any on our guest list today to explain to us, how do we know, how can we spot it?
Well, it's extremely difficult for the average individual to be expected to identify a radical or even a budding terrorist. It's not like they come into the mosque with a sign saying, I'm a terrorist, report me. And really, it's the authorities who have more of a responsibility, because, authorities can actually intercept phone calls, intercept internet communications. So they would have more of an understanding, an idea of how far along the process they are. But for the average person, what you have to look for is a cluster of behaviors. If a person just suddenly becomes religious, that in itself is not a proof that they're becoming violent or extremist. But if you join that with, took travel to a place where there is known jihadi activity and training, has been meeting with known recruiters and extremists, that's a red flag. And the question is, again, well, who's supposed to do it? The imam is generally somebody who people, they confide in. They don't like the idea that the imam's going to then report me to the FBI or the government. So, even I think what imams need to be trained in is the same thing that school counselors are, where you have a duty to report, where that something is up and something's about to happen. There's a legal obligation that you report the person. But if they're just talking and other signs are not there, then the imam or whoever the counselor is should just stay within their realm of activity and leave it to others who have more competency in actually intervening directly. This could be other community members in the community who know the topics and who can talk to them, who have some street credibility. But everyone has their role to play indeed.
JM?
Well, really, this question of how do you spot somebody who's becoming radicalized to the point of doing violence is a huge one in the public conversation right now. The short answer is without sort of law enforcement powers and evidence about activities, it's very difficult to just spot from somebody's beliefs or their attitudes or ideology who's going to become violent. So I follow more than 1,000 different feeds online of different kinds of radicals, all different flavors and different ideologies, not just Muslim. I couldn't tell you. I could not tell you from reading these guys, from spending time with it, every day, from studying this subject. I could not pick people off of that list and say these are the ones who are going to become violent. I have hunches, but so far none of those hunches has played out yet. So it's a really tough problem, and that's one reason I tend to be a little bit discouraging about focusing on radicalization as a means of counterterrorism.
JM, it's interesting you said that there's a solution suggested by one member of our community, Lantana, says what needs to happen is we need to censor Al-Awlaki's online videos. Anwar Al-Awlaki, referencing the one that Femi played in the main show. It will greatly reduce, quote unquote, terrorist antisocial behavior. But someone else tweets back, Zohra, she says, instead, let's educate empty minds. Instead of guarding the gates of communication, evil will continue to exist. Let's nourish civility. And that's followed up by Reza, who says, But the problem is we want quick fixes, and curtailing civil liberties is always the safest route politically in the long run. So Harris, I guess the question is, does that mean, in reference to this last tweet about curtailing civil liberties, we're online, and even Femi and I in the research for doing the show wanted to know what we should click on. What's the risk of being monitored, especially if you're a Muslim American or a member of a minority group? You go to one of these sites, you look at Anwar al-Awlaki's video online. Does that mean that you are automatically listed as someone to be watched?
Well, I hope not. I think those risks generally are there, and communities do feel that. People will say, I don't want to go on a website because I'll be watched by the FBI. But I think there's an important point to be made here. Peter Newman, who's an expert on online radicalization for the Bipartisan Policy Center, talks about this idea that you can censor your way out of this problem. You cannot. Studies have shown that if you try to shut down Anwar al-Awlaki's websites or videos, it'll just pop up somewhere else. The internet is too vast of a place to censor our way out of this. That does not work. And then on civil liberties, even the former head of the CIA and FBI official will say that there's a point of diminishing return if you're going to curtail people's civil liberties. You're not going to, Patriot Act your way out of this problem either. What needs to happen is that there needs to be strong, emotive counter narratives to this issue. You need to address the same policy grievances that Anwar al-Awlaki talks about, but in a positive way, with the same emotions, with the same imagery, with the same ability for people to relate to it, for young people especially. And Mobeen was talking about the fact that the demographics is young males to a large extent, and they are attracted to these emotive videos and conversations. And so the counter narrative, if it's imams, if it's communities, if it's organizations, if they're going to put videos out there, it has to be as emotive and as breathtaking as these videos out there.
I want to put a personal slant on this. So say I'm your little boy, I know you've got a little boy, and I'm growing up in this atmosphere and I'm part of the Muslim community. How is his day-to-day life? How is he feeling? How are kids in that generation feeling about this idea that, if they're from a certain community, that they should be monitored, they should be watched?
It's interesting that you bring this up. I have an 11-year-old son, and my 11-year-old son had watched a commercial on CNN about this topic and about American Muslims and national security. And he came to me one day. He said, Baba, do all Muslims stone people to death? Now, I can't imagine. I grew up as an 11-year-old in Los Angeles. I couldn't imagine kind of feeling that weight of a community on my shoulders. It has an impact on identity formation of a community. So that's why the media has an important role to play. They have to be a bit more responsible. Our policymakers have to be more responsible, and communities have to be more engaged in the conversation so that burden does not fall on young people.
JM and Mubin and Harris, I've really enjoyed the conversation today. I'm going to ask you to do something incredibly difficult, and that is in just a line or a thought, sum up what people should go home with. Harris, you just did it beautifully. Right. So JM, I'm going to go to you first. What should people's takeaway be from what you had to bring to this conversation?
I think that targeting radicalization as a counterterrorism policy is problematic because there are so many radicals. It just encourages the kind of cultural and societal pressures that Harris was just discussing. I think that the law enforcement approach, where you look for illegal acts and indicators of illegal acts, remains the most effective way of trying to counter terrorism. And I think that counter-radicalization narratives are important for societies and for cultures, and they should be pursued by members of societies and cultures. I just think that calling it counterterrorism is not supported very well by the evidence.
Beautiful. One sentence. But very nicely put. Very long sentence with lots of commas in there. Mubin, the pressure is on. Your one sentence, our takeaway. What is it from this conversation?
Look, we have to work together. There's so many radicals out there on all sides. Let us decide which side we're on. Are we peacemakers or are we peace breakers? Simple.
Mubin, Harris, JM, it's been such a pleasure. Malika and the millions of the community
who are still tweeting in.
Absolutely. That conversation continues online as always. Thank you very much to all of our guests. Coming up on tomorrow's program, we're looking at the clothing industry. If we spend $10 for a t-shirt, what does that mean for the countries and the factories where people are making it? Are people dying so we have cheap fashion? You can find out on tomorrow's edition of The Stream. In the meantime, you know where to find us. We'll be online.